Shalom and good evening. This is TV7 Israel News broadcasting to you from Jerusalem. And in today's top stories, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reveals that most Arab countries no longer view Israel as their enemy, but rather view it as their indispensable ally in the battle against militant Islam. The Israeli Security Cabinet decides to withhold around 5% of taxes that are transferred on a monthly basis to the Palestinian Authority over its continued financial support for families and Palestinians that were either killed or incarcerated during terror-related offences. A summit that was scheduled to take place in Jerusalem this week between Israel and 4 Central European nations that are known as the Visegrad group was cancelled after the Polish government withdrew from the conference in protest over Israeli remarks about Poland's role in the Holocaust. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu revealed that most Arab countries no longer view Israel as their enemy, but rather view it as their indispensable ally. In an address to the annual Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, Netanyahu stressed that the factor that unites Israel with the majority of the Arab countries is the ongoing battle against the two streams of militant Islam, including the extreme Sunni Muslims, which are led by the Islamic State, and the extreme Shiite Muslims that are led by the Islamic Republic of Iran.
With the Arab countries, as with many Muslim countries, the question is how to fight militant Islam. And recently in Warsaw, you saw something spectacular. I did. There were 60 foreign ministers, representatives of 60 countries, in a hall, about the size of this hall, with the representatives from half a dozen Arab countries who got on the stage and spoke about Iran. They said Iran is the greatest danger we face. They spoke about Israel. One of them said, when asked, what about Israel's military action against Iran's efforts to entrench itself in Syria? The answer was, every country has a right to defend itself. Not bad. They spoke about seeking solutions to problems in the Middle East. They said, yes, we want to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, but no, it cannot be solved unless we roll back Iran's aggression. Did you hear that? That's a change.
The Prime Minister also pointed to the fact that the Israeli-Palestinian problem was no longer perceived as the key obstacle to Jerusalem's relations with the international community at large and the Arab world in particular. Netanyahu insinuated that while Israel aspires to resolve its decade-old conflict with the Palestinians, their historic reluctance to compromise for peace has situated them on the bottom of the list of Jerusalem's diplomatic engagement. Now to the West Bank city of Ramallah, where hundreds of Palestinians protested a decision by the Israeli Security Cabinet to withhold around 5% of taxes that are transferred on a monthly basis to the Palestinian Authority over its continued financial support for convicted terrorists and their families. Under the 1993 Oslo Accords, Israel collects taxes on behalf of the Palestinian Authority, who has put the current sums at a little over $220 million a month. The decision to freeze 5% of the monthly taxes came after the Palestinian Authority has rejected repeated Israeli demands to halt its practice of paying monthly stipends to families of Palestinians that were either killed or incarcerated during terror-related offenses, with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas calling them heroes of the national Palestinian struggle. In an effort to combat its practice, the Israeli parliament adopted a new law in 2018 that effectively provides the Israeli Security Cabinet with the legal power to act by slashing the amount the Palestinian Authority pays to terrorists and their families from taxes transferred to them on a monthly basis. After the new law was legislated, Israeli security officials presented data to the effect that in 2018, the Palestinian Authority transferred a little over 500,000 shekels to terrorists imprisoned in Israel and their families, a sum equal to some 121,000 euros and 137,000 US dollars. Therefore, the Israeli Security Cabinet released a statement in which it announced its decision to freeze the same amount of funds from the tax revenues that Israel collects for the Palestinian Authority. The Israeli decision has infuriated the Palestinian Authority, which warned of dire consequences that may even lead to an outburst of violence. According to the chairman of the Palestinian Prisoner Club, the Palestinian Authority is currently considering its options and will take a set of actions to counter the Israeli measure.
السلطة ستتخذ مجموعة من الإجراءات أعتقد أن من بينها سيكون عدم استلام أجورة واحدة إلا إذا وصلت حقوقنا الضريبية كاملة. الخطوة التالية منع دخول البضائع الإسرائيلية. لا يجوز أن نبقى سوقا للشركات والمصانع الإسرائيلية. إضافة إلى ذلك أن الجماهير الفلسطينية ستخرج إلى الشوارع لتعبر عن رفضها لهذه السياسات.
It is important to know that while the Palestinian taxes make up a large portion of the Palestinian Authority's budget, an estimated 30% of its annual budget comes from foreign aid, with the European Union topping the list as the most generous donor. Furthermore, it has been revealed that the Palestinians declined last month some $60 million in U.S. annual funding for the Palestinian security forces. According to a Palestinian source, the decision was made after concerns emerged about the possibility of exposure to lawsuits under the new U.S. anti-terror law known as the Taylor Force Act, which allows the U.S. administration to sharply reduce aid to the Palestinian Authority if it won't stop the stipends to terrorists and their families. The United States passed the Taylor Force Act last year after a 29-year-old American military veteran was fatally stabbed by a Palestinian terrorist while visiting Israel in 2016. Now in other news, a summit that was scheduled to take place in Jerusalem this week between Israel and the four Central European nations that are known as the Visegrad group was cancelled after the Polish government withdrew from the conference in protest over the Israeli remarks about Poland's role in the Holocaust. The crisis emerged last week after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly said that the Poles had collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II. In response to Netanyahu's statement, his Polish counterpart, Morawiecki, condemned the Israeli Prime Minister and considered cancelling his participation in the Visegrad Group's conference. Last-minute attempts were made, however, by the Israeli mission in Poland to salvage the conference by downplaying Netanyahu's referred-to comment. According to the Israeli ambassador to Warsaw, Anna Azari, Netanyahu referred to the Polish law that forbids people in the country from accusing Poland of collaborating with Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. Regrettably, Jerusalem's attempts to downplay the crisis failed after the newly appointed Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz blatantly accused Poles of collaborating with the Third Reich, further escalating the crisis.
קודם כל, בדיפלומטיה תמיד מנסים שאנשים לא ייעלבו, אבל אף אחד לא ישנה את האמת ההיסטורית עבור שום דבר מהסוג הזה.
שהפולנים שיתפו פעולה עם הנאצים.
פולנים שיתפו פעולה עם הנאצים, בהחלט, שיתפו פעולה עם הנאצים.
תראה מה יאיר לפיד כתב.
איך אמר יצחק שמיר? הרי אביו נרצח על ידי פולנים, הוא אמר שמבחינתו הם ינקו את האנטישמיות מחלב אימם. אי אפשר לייפות את ההיסטוריה הזאת, ואנחנו כאלה שנושאים את מורשת השואה, כל עם ישראל, לא חשוב מאיפה הוא בא, אנחנו נמשיך ונעשה את זה.
In response to this interview, Poland immediately announced that it would not attend the Visegrad summit in Israel and condemned the newly appointed Israeli top diplomat for his harsh comments, which the Polish Prime Minister referred to as totally unacceptable.
Podjąłem decyzję o odwołaniu polskiej delegacji z spotkania w Izraelu, które było wcześniej zaplanowane, a więc również nie pojedzie tam pan minister spraw zagranicznych, pan Jacek Czaputowicz. Podjąłem taką decyzję, ponieważ te sformułowania, które padły z ust powołanego na ministra spraw zagranicznych pana Katza są absolutnie niedopuszczalne. Są niedopuszczalne nie tylko w dyplomacji, ale dla mnie one są niedopuszczalne absolutnie w sferze publicznej po prostu. Polacy byli narodem najbardziej poszkodowanym obok Żydów, Romów w czasie II wojny światowej.
The Israeli Foreign Ministry in Jerusalem refused to respond to TV7's request for comment at this stage. Thank you for watching us. Keep praying for the peace of Israel and the peace of Jerusalem. I'm Jonathan Hassan. Have an Erev Tov, and we will see you again tomorrow at the same time.